A new model for identity politics, a contrastivist application. So far, this book has been addressing the objections raised against IP. Some involve misunderstandings, but others are legitimate. Most of the misunderstandings come from a lack of nuance or qualification being applied to the concepts. There is a relatively new philosophical method that attempts to resolve philosophical problems. It claims to do this by illuminating different qualified versions of existing concepts, called contrast classes. This method is called contrastivism. The kind of contrastivism I'll be using in this discussion comes from philosopher Walter Sinnott-Armstrong. At this stage in the book, I will leave the topic of IP for the moment and analyze Sinnott-Armstrong's contrastivism for its merits and limitations. In his Contrastivist Manifesto, Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, claims that whenever we give a reason for something, that reason is always contrastive, because it will always be a reason for one thing as opposed to something else. And since philosophy always depends on reasons, and reasons depend on relevant contrasts, contrastivism will benefit a great number of philosophical disputes. Such disputes, Sinnott-Armstrong points out, are the free will problem, the problem of skepticism, moral dilemmas, the problem of causation, and so on. Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, demonstrates how contrastivism works by applying it to the problem of skepticism. He begins by putting the contrastivism of skepticism in the following logical form. Someone, S, is justified out of a contrast class, C, in believing a proposition, P, when and only when S is able to rule out all other members of C, but is not able to rule out P. Regarding the problem of skepticism, Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, identifies three contrast classes to consider, which are the extreme contrast class for P, all propositions contrary to P, including skeptical scenarios that are systematically uneliminable. The rigorous contrast class for P, all propositions contrary to P that could be eliminated in some way, even in doing so is not needed in order to meet normal standards. The modest contrast class for P, all propositions contrary to P that could be eliminated and need not be eliminated in order to meet normal standards. Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, applies these contrast classes to an example of observing a zebra in a zoo. He said that he is justified in believing he is observing a zebra in the modest contrast class, but is not justified in believing he is observing a zebra in the extreme or rigorous contrast class. This is because in the modest contrast class, he can rule out that he is observing other animals in their natural state. But in the extreme contrast class, he cannot rule out that he is a brain in a vat that thinks he is seeing a zebra. And in the rigorous contrast class, he cannot rule out that he is observing a painted mule, unless he goes beyond observation and sprays it with a hose to rule this out. From this point, Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, mentions that in common language we express our justification for belief without appealing to the contrast class, because we assume that the contrast class we are using is the correct one. So, when we say, I am justified in believing this is a zebra, is to actually say, I am justified in believing this is a zebra under the modest contrast class, which is the relevant one. However, relevance, according to Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, is not entailed, but presupposed. What he means by this is that relevance is a normative claim, which explains why there is a disagreement. There is a disagreement because when one person says they are justified without qualification and another person says they are not justified without qualification, they are presupposing relevance to the different contrast classes. Sinnott-Armstrong moves on to critically analyze some positions other than contrastivism. The one I'll discuss here is contextualism. Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, describes contextualism as who hold that the relevant contrast class varies so that the modest contrast class is relevant in some contexts, but the extreme contrast class is relevant in other contexts. The first charge Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, anticipates is that there is a problem of indeterminacy. He gives an example of a waiter who tells you his name is Jeff. Sinnott-Armstrong says whatever contrast class we decide is relevant regarding knowing the waiter's name, such as in contrast to all male names. We'll not know which names belong to this class. Sinnott-Armstrong uses the example of the name Jeff, spelt Geoff, to push this point, arguing that we do not have the means to assert whether this qualifies as a relevant alternative. Second, Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, considers a possible response by the contextualist that relevance is decided by the purpose being held by the epistemic judge. However, he argues that not only could judges have multiple purposes, their purposes may differ from judge to judge. If the contextualist says that this applies to any purpose, then it is too wide, and that if it applies to all purposes, then it is too narrow. So, Sinnott-Armstrong mentions that purposes cross contexts, and gives an example of a philosopher's purpose in his field holds the extreme contrast class as relevant, but a doctor will hold either the rigorous or modest contrast class as relevant in his field. So, according to Sinnott-Armstrong, there is no way for us to tell which one is relevant. Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, believes that we can solve, or to use his words, dissolve, these problems by appealing to Pyrrhonian skepticism regarding contrast classes. A Pyrrhonian skeptic approach says that we should suspend judgment about which contrast class is the relevant one. He stresses here that this is not to reject all contrast classes as relevant or irrelevant, but merely not to take a position. This way, this version of contrastivism can coherently say that we are justified in believing something in one contrast class, but not another, without taking on any of the problems he says that contextualism has. In his conclusion, Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, encourages with passion for all philosophers to join him in his contrastivism, where he says, Contrastivism is, thus, not yet completely unified as a movement. Still, our differences strike me as matters of detail or emphasis when compared with the differences between contrastivism and other more traditional epistemologies, including contextualism. That is why my manifesto calls for unified action. Contrastivists of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but dubious, unqualified epistemic judgments. So, this is Sinnott-Armstrong's Pyrrhonian contrastivism. I'll now address criticisms raised against this position put forward by Martin Bloor and Sinnott-Armstrong's response to these criticisms. Bloor, 2008, views this kind of contrastivism to be revisionist, because the contrasts are not based on what someone explicitly says, but what is implicit in what they say. The problem Bloor sees with this view is that when applied to justification, telling someone to make their contrast class explicit invokes surprise and confusion, whereas in other cases it does not invoke such reactions. The example Bloor gives is someone saying a man is tall, and with someone else asking, tall for what? Tall for a basketball player? Bloor argues that we usually don't need a qualification spelled out to us to understand that somebody is tall. Therefore, Bloor prefers understanding epistemic judgments based on what is explicitly said in common language, not what is implicit. Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, agrees with Bloor's description of his contrastivism as revisionist, but disagrees that this is a problem. Sinnott-Armstrong tested Bloor's claim regarding surprise and confusion, and found this reaction applied to claims about tallness as well. Hence, if reactions of surprise and confusion suggest that those claims must be wrong, then contrastive claims on tallness must be wrong, which is something impossible to accept. I agree with Sinnott-Armstrong on this point. Furthermore, it seems very odd to analyze any claim at only what is explicitly said. We depend upon looking deeper into what is actually being said all the time as cooperative interlocutors. For example, if my friend and I are planning to go to the beach, and my friend looks outside and makes the utterance, "It is raining," I would not take this as an arbitrary statement about the weather. I would understand this as, "We cannot go to the beach because it is raining." The second objection raised by Bloor, 2008, is that a Pyrrhonian skepticism undermines our ability to be epistemically responsible, and demonstrates this with a simple thought experiment. Jane's plane has just arrived in Amsterdam. On disembarking, she asks the nearest steward, "Would you happen to know where I can find the train station?" The steward answers that she can find the train station underneath the airport. Jane forms the corresponding belief. Jane is a highly responsible epistemic agent, and she wonders whether she actually is justified in believing that the train station is beneath the airport. Bloor argues that merely stating that Jane is justified in the modest contrast class and not in the extreme contrast class, without adding that the modest contrast class is the relevant one, tells Jane nothing about whether she is justified that the train station is beneath the airport. Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, responds to this by saying that Jane does not need to be absolutely justified, or justified without qualification to still be epistemically responsible, because being justified in the modest contrast class is enough to suit her practical purposes. This response strikes me as appeal to relevance, because Sinnott-Armstrong wants to avoid. Why does the extreme contrast class not suit someone's practical purposes? A possible response could be that not much can be done if we are a brain in a vat, or being deceived by an evil demon, and any action we choose would be of no consequence, or that we would have no means of predicting the consequences of our actions. Whereas, in the modest contrast class, our actions do have consequences, and we do have the means to predict the consequences of our actions. Thus why in this case the modest contrast class is the relevant one for Jane. It is not at all clear why practical purposes does not count as a criterion for relevance. A possible solution to Sinnott-Armstrong may find palatable is, instead of avoiding the topic of relevance altogether, is to include relevance as a contrast class. An amendment to the contrastivist logical form could look like this. X is justified in believing Y in contrast to P, which is relevant in respect to Q. To apply this to the Jane example, Jane is justified in believing the train station is beneath the airport in contrast to the modest contrast class, which is relevant in respect to Jane's practical purposes. However, both Sinnott-Armstrong and Bloor may respond that this is contextualism, or at least the difference between this and contextualism is arbitrary. If this charge is correct, then Sinnott-Armstrong's criticism of contextualism will need to be addressed, which has been done by Bloor, who thinks contextualism is superior to Pyrrhonian contrastivism. Bloor, 2008, firstly argues that the limitations of contextualism regarding the indeterminacy of the size and the content of the modest contrast class also applies to the contrastivist. Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, says that the contextualists need to be able to rule out all members in their chosen relevant contrast class. But since Pyrrhonian skeptics do not worry about relevance, they are not in the same predicament as the contextualist. Sinnott-Armstrong anticipates the objection that he himself uses contrast classes like the modest contrast class, but points out that he is only using such terms as a matter of convenience and does not need to be used as a contrast class. However, if he asserts this, then this argument against Bloor's Jane thought experiment falls apart. he defends Jane's epistemic responsibility by appealing to her practical purposes within the modest contrast class. If he thinks the existence of the modest contrast class does not matter, then we are left with little means to establish what contrast class is the one that suits Jane's practical purposes. Hence, Sinnott-Armstrong needs to allow some room for relevance and accept the limitations of indeterminacy, or ignore relevance and accept the limitation of epistemic responsibility. The last defense of contextualism made by Bloor, 2008, is that there are cases where contrasts are obviously relevant. He uses Sinnott-Armstrong's Jeff, J-E-F-F, Jeff, G-E-O-F-F example, as opposed to any other name imagined as an alternative. Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, says that this only tells us that it appears to be relevant, not that it's really relevant. However, just because something cannot be shown to be relevant in the absolute sense, does not mean it cannot be shown to exist at all. We can consistently apply relevance if we contrast or contextualize it. For instance, if I'm walking to the train station at 8:59 a.m. and my train arrives at 9 a.m., the fact that it is 8:59 a.m. is relevant to me, but irrelevant to the man I just walked past who does not need to catch that train. Relevance can also come in degrees. Imagine if the prosecution were collecting evidence for a murder trial, and one piece of evidence was a witness who heard yelling and screaming from the crime scene, and the other was the murder weapon with the accused's DNA all over it. Clearly the latter is more relevant than the former, but both would still be relevant. Bloor, 2008, also argues that the Jeff with a J, Jeff with a G problem can be solved with contextualism by acknowledging the context that we know the waiter's name in the acoustic sense, but do not know how it is spelled. Sinnott-Armstrong, 2008, accuses Bloor of changing the question. The question is not whether I know how his name is spelt. The question is whether I know his name. I don't agree that to know one's name requires knowing how it is spelt. I tested this with my father, whose name is Brian, spelt B-R-I-A-N. I asked him if he asked someone to write down his name, and they wrote down B-R-Y-A-N. Would that mean that they don't know his name? He quickly responded, "Of course not. They just don't know how to spell it." Furthermore, if not knowing how to spell one's name entails they don't know the person's name at all, then anyone who is illiterate doesn't know anyone's name. Thus, Bloor is justified in making the distinction between acoustic names and spelt names. The main issue of Sinnott-Armstrong's contrastivism surrounds what he means by real relevance. If he means to say that we should reject questions of what is ultimately relevant regardless of any point of view, then I agree with that rejection. So, I'll assume that this is what he means by really relevant. From this, the disagreements between Sinnott-Armstrong and Bloor seem arbitrary. If we can speak of relevance in degrees, or in a relativistic sense, then I see no issue in applying either Bloor's contextualism or Sinnott-Armstrong's contrastivism. Nonetheless, from this point on, I'll apply the language of Sinnott-Armstrong's contrastivism. In the next chapter, I'll apply contrastivism to the topics discussed in the previous chapters.